We're on Daf Chav Ches Amid Beis, and we're studying the story of Rab Nechemia that began on Chav Ches Amid Aleph at the bottom of the Ovid. Havikama Aber L'Sakina, he would wipe the blade of his knife, Afuma, on the mouth, the outer rim, Didikula, of a basket. The Amrile, and the Gemara tells that when Rava heard about this story, he questioned Rav Nechemia, excuse me, and he asked him, "L'chadada kavid mar o lahavir shamnu nisa?" What was your intention? What was your goal? Were you sharpening the knife, or were you just cleaning the knife of its stuck-on oil, the fatty substance? The Amar Li. And he responded that lahavir shamnu nisa. I'm only interested in cleaning out the knife. Chazisi l'daite, but yet I realized that that wasn't really his intention, but rather the lechadada ka'avid. His motivation and his goal was to sharpen the knife. But yet he didn't want to reveal that secret. Why? Because kasavar halacha, we paskin like Rabbi Yehuda, who's matir even machshirei ochel nefesh on yontif, but ain morin came. We don't publicly declare that. We're always afraid that people might expand that heter and be mezalzel and come to do a tikkun of ochlim, and they could have done it on erev yontif, and they're going to do it on yontif, thinking that they have a blanket carte blanche heter, and they're allowed to do all malachas that are connected to ochel nefesh, even those that could have been implemented on erev yontif. So that's called halacha Rabbi Yehuda. That lachem means lachol tzarchechem, and the Torah is matir even machshirei ochel nefesh, but halacha ve'ein morin. That's why he didn't want to reveal that when he was sharpening the knife, he was doing it for the sake of sharpening the knife, not just to cleanse the knife. Amar Abai, another story. Avika imna kame demar. I was in the presence of Rabbah. Vavikoma aber sakina asifsa derechaya. And I noticed that Rabbah was cleaning the blade of his knife on the outer rim of the mill, the reichayim. The Amrile, I asked him, "L'chadra kaboy mar o lahaver shamnusa?" Normally lahaver shamnusa because this is the daitidul chadra kaboy. Once again, he presented it as if he was doing it just for the purpose of cleaning the knife, when really, in truth, he was sharpening the knife. Because Savar halacha ki Rabbi Yehuda v'ein morin. Now, there's halacha that before a shochet slaughters an animal, he has to take the knife to the chacham, to the posek, who's got a paskin, whether or not the knife is kosher for shchita. There are no nicks, so there won't be any psulei shchita of hagramo or any of the other psulei shchita. And the question is, are you allowed to take the knife to the chacham on yontif? Iboilahu. This is where we vacillate. Is it permissible to show the knife of the shochet to the Rav, the chacham, on yontif, to have him paskin on it? Is it something like a Masechet, and it's done publicly and people hear about it and it's mezalzel in yontif? Or should we say no? It's not like, he's selling the meat publicly or so. It's not a Masechet. It's a shaila about the knife. Rav Mori braid Rav Bizna Shari, Rav Banan Asri. The Gemara records a machlokas about this very question. Rav Mori would allow a chacham to check out the knife on yontif and paskin whether the knife is kosher or not. Rav Banan prohibited it. It looks like he's a professional shochet and he's going to sell his meat, and this is a Masechet. Rav Yosef Omar, Rav Yosef says that, you know what, we're not going to allow the butcher to show the knife to a chacham, because that's kemaisa chol, the Talmud chacham ro liatzmo. If he's a scholar and he can paskin on the knife himself, then he's allowed to paskin on the knife, even though, again, he doesn't want to use the knife. He's not shechting any animals. He's a Talmud chacham, but he knows how to paskin. He owns a knife. Maybe this is the knife that he did shimush with when he was learning Hilchot Shmita. He'll check out the knife on Yontif, that's mutter, perfectly legit, and then he'll give it over to someone else, even if it's a butcher, to shech the animal. Mash'ila le'acher. And that's not considered pirsu, because it wasn't the tabach who's in the eye of the whole community who went to check the knife and ran around and looked for a rav and so forth. So it was just this private, humble, quiet person, a Talmud Chacham, and he paskined on the knife. Now he can give it to the ochet, and it's not considered piercing. Now, the Shulchan Aruch writes that a Chacham who checks out his own knife is allowed to lend it to someone else. And it sounds like the Shulchan Aruch is only allowing it b'di'evet. Once he already checked out the knife, then we're going to allow him to lend it, and the tabach will borrow it. And the Pri Chodesh is interested in knowing what's the source for the Shulchan Aruch that this is only a b'di'evet. He suggests that perhaps once the Talmud Chacham is checking the knife, knowing full well that his intention is to lend it to the tabach, and that's his purpose, he's not doing it for himself, that already gives it a little bit of an element of a ma'aseh chol. Now, he quotes Achronim that interpret the Rambam, Shelo yireh lechatchila li'atzmo, kimo sheyochol loses acher kach li'acher. Today, in other words, if his purpose is to check out the knife so he can give it to someone else, that's not something that lechatchila we would permit. Hatam, Kevin shugam litzorech acherim gozu chacham shelo yireh. And again, the acherim here will think that this is okay, but it's really not a situation where we want to let it get out of hand, and it's going to become complicated ahead to the people, even a tavach who will take it to a chacham and so forth. In other words, he sharpened his knife, but yet, although it's not full of nicks or anything, it's not cutting properly. So it still is viable as a knife. He could use it to cut his meat, but it's not as sharp, won't do as good of a job as he would like. Says Rabbi Yosef, mutar lechadida b'yontif. We're going to pass like Rabbi Yehuda, who is matir, tikun machshirei ochel nefesh, even though, again, it's halach of a morin kain, but hanimili hu de paska agav duchaka. We're only going to allow, says Rabbi Yosef, to sharpen the knife that pasak chiduda, it's not as sharp as he wants on Yontif, if dochkin asakin hichoteches, it's still a functional knife, even without sharpening it. So let's say on a scale from 0 to 100, it'll do the job at 60, 65, but it'll do the job. So he doesn't really desperately need a tikkun on the knife by sharpening it. He could use the knife, if need be, in a fallback position, even without sharpening it. But if, on the other hand, the knife has gone beyond success, it's below 50%, it's a failure. The knife is just not sharp, it's dull. Then you're not allowed to sharpen it on Yontif because that's already an extra tircha to be metaken that knife, which is now basically non-functional. Darshav Chizdavi, Peimar of Yosef, Echad Sakin Shenifkema, the Echad Shapud Shenirtzam, the Echad Grifas Tanu of the Kirayim the Yontif, Banu Lemachlokes Rav Yehuda Virabanan. What are the three cases listed here? First, we have a case of a sakin shel shechita that became pagum, guma, and it's no longer viable, cannot be used for slaughtering an animal. Second case is a spit, which is used, of course, to pierce through the meat and then roast the meat on an open fire. And in this case, the head of the shipud is kind of nirtzam. Nirtzam means it's like broken off. And you need that sharp edge, or perhaps the rounder edge of the shipud in order to achieve the tzli. So now we have a case of a vessel, a utensil that's not functional. Now we have a third case where you have a small oven and it's in need of what's called grifas tanu. And it's full of something that's called in Hebrew tiach, and you've got to remove this tiach before you can find it function. And as a result, I guess, of usage over and over again, the oven gets full of all this tiach. And as a result, it's not functional. So in all these cases, we have a machlokas between Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbana. The Sanya, we learned in the Beitza, ein ben yontif l'Shabbos, ela ochel nefesh bilvad. Rabbi Yehuda matir af machshire ochel nefesh. And all these cases are fixing up a vessel, and we're doing so for the sake of ochel nefesh. It is tzorech machshire ochel nefesh, to prepare for the ability to cook the food for Yontif. So the Gemara asks, my time of the Tanakama, why do the Chachamim that disagree with Rabbi Yehuda limit ochel nefesh and refuse to expand the heter of ochel nefesh to include machshir ochel nefesh? Amar Kra, I'll read the whole pasuk. Ach asher ye'ochel ochel nefesh hu levado yosel lachem. Pasuk in Parshas Bo, and it says who, which is an extra word, and it's a mute. Hu v'lo machshira. So ochel nefesh mamish, but not machshir ochel nefesh. Rabbi Yehuda Amar Kra lachem. What about the extra word lachem, which is not a miyut, but rather a ribu, lachem l'chol tzorchechem, including even machshirei ochel nefesh? So the Gemara immediately asks, v'tanakama haksiv lachem. What would the Tanakama do with the ribui of lachem? Amar lach, the Tanakama would say to you, Ahu, that extra word lachem is lachem. I'm going to use it as a mute. How could I turn the word lachem min akotza lakotza from a mute, from a ribui to a mute? The answer is lachem below lin nachrim. So we don't do malacha for the purpose of a nachri on Yontif. The idach nami, Rabbi Yehuda allows even machshir ochel nefesh. Aksiv hu, what are you going to do with the miyud hu? Amalacha ksiv hu uksiv lachem. So who is a miut and lachem is a ribuy? We're going to use the ribuy of lachem to include machshir ochel nefesh. What do we do with who? I mean, who also is clearly a miut to exclude ochel nefesh. So we have a stira. Lo kash. Kan b'machshirin shef shalasos erev yontiv. V'kan b'machshirim she efshar lasosam me erev yontiv. Now, when Rav Chizda or Rav Yosef listed those three cases of either a sakin or a shapud or a tanu that couldn't be used as it were, and Rav Chizda said this halacha in all these three cases depends upon Rabbi Yehuda and Chacham. He didn't mean to say that we paskin one way or the other. In the previous sugya, we saw halacha vein morin came that we do paskin like Rabbi Yehuda, and we would be matir machshirei ochel nefesh, even if it's not roy, even if it's in a state now that it needs a complete haul over. In other words, it needs a tikkun. But although Rabbi Yehuda would permit it because it comes under lachem l'chol tzarchechem, nevertheless, we would not paskin like that l'chatchila. That's called halacha vein morin. Now, Rabbi Yehuda himself differentiates between machshir and shef shalas sosan me'erev yontiv and machshir and she'ef shalas sosan me'erev yontiv. You get the impression that this distinction is a doraisa because we have two psukim. We have hu and lachem. So lachem is going to include machshir ochel nefesh. Hu is going to exclude a machshir ochel nefesh. And Rabbi Yehuda is going to interpret it that lachem includes ochel nefesh, machshir ochel nefesh, which could not have been done on Erev Yontif, whereas hu comes to exclude machshir ochel nefesh that could have been easily done on Erev Yontif. So, for example, if we go back to Rav Chizda or Rav Yosef, sakin shenifkama, it would really depend upon whether it was nifkama on Yontif itself or on Erev Yontif. If it was nifkama on Erev Yontif, we're going to apply the exclusion of hu, v'lo machshirin she'ef shalasosim b'bod yom b'Erev Yontif. If on the other hand the sakin was nifkama on Yontif, then we apply the ribuy of lachem l'chol tzarchem afilu l'machshir ochel nefesh. And all this seems to be a doraisa. One question that is raised in the Rishonim is what would Rabbi Yehuda say about ochel nefesh mamish she'ef shalas osan me'erev yontiv? Would he agree that that's also, but again, only midrabanan? See, until now we're dealing with doraisas. So machshire ochel nefesh, we have to be more machmir. And if it's ef shalas osan b'bod yom, then the Torah prohibits it. But in ochel nefesh mamish, which is 1 degree higher, even if he could have done it yesterday before Yontif, it's very possible that, the Torah would allow it, the Rabbanan might prohibit it. Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Shmuel, shapud shenirtzaf. So we're talking about a case of a shapud, of a spit they got a bad bang, so to speak. In other words, somebody stepped on it or it fell. And nismayach v'nisakem, it's fakrum. It's a little bit out of, bent out of shape, as we would say. But even though people stepped on it and bent out of shape, it's still not broken. Also, l'sakno b'yontif. We're not allowed to fix it on yontif because this is called the torach shelo l'tzorach. Since he can still use the spit, it's not broken. It's still functional, and we're not going to allow him to do this. And again, it could be that Rabbi Yehuda would allow it, but halacha vein morin came. So the Gemara asks Pshita, why did Shmuel have to add this? What's the chiddush involved? Lo tzricha di'afagav the mifshit biyode. Shmuel had to tell me a chiddush in a case where he can straighten it out with his own hands. He doesn't even need the tools like a hammer to straighten it out. And you would think, therefore, it's not a Maisa Uman, it's not something that would be Meleches Machsheves, it would not come under the Isa Malacha of Tikkun Moneh, and therefore we would allow it. Kamachma, no. We don't fix up a utensil on Yontif. That's not Ochel Nefesh. That's Machshire Ochel Nefesh, but not Ochel Nefesh Mamish. Yomer Rabbi Yehuda Shmuel Shapud Shetzolobo Basar. Now, after you roast whatever you roast, let's say meat, using this shipud, the spit gets full of grease and it's kind of repulsive. And also letaltalo biyontif. It now is considered mos. It's repulsive. And therefore, it comes under muktzah machmas mius. Now, again, if somehow rain would come down and clean it out, that would be a sugya that we'll have later on in this parak, which is called ein muktzah or yesh muktzah b'chatzi shah. But right now, in the state that it's in, it's not usable. It's below the lowest, standard. It's repulsive. It's muktzah machmas. Now, the big question here is that Rabbi Shimon, who's Mekil in Mukta, is Mekil Dafka in Mukta Machmas Mius. Is this sugya against Rabbi Shimon? When it says Osel Taltalo Biyantifu Mukta Machmas Mius? So the Rashba says that Af Shebeshavas Posku Halacha Rabbi Shimon, and Shmuel holds that as far as Mukta, we pass like Rabbi Shimon, but Le'inyan Mukta Machmas Mius, Omer Rav Nachman, B'Yontif Yesh LaHachmer. Unbelievable. Rabbi Shimon is going to be more machmer on Yontif than on Shabbos. On Shabbos, mukta machmas mius, in the case of the candelabra that was extinguished and it's full of, used up filthy oil. Rabbi Shimon is going to be mekil, and we probably accept Rabbi Shimon. But on Yontif, he's going to be machmer. As the Gemara says, the beginning of Masechet Beitza, you may recall that because Yontif is more kal than Shabbos, osil zilzulit. And that's what we're seeing here, a chumrah in Yontif that doesn't apply to Shabbos, and that's the case of Muktzah Machmas Mius. Rav Ad Barav Omer Rav Malkio, please underline the word Malkio, Shomto, Umenicho B'Keren Zobs. What you're allowed to do is what we call tiltul min atzad. Instead of taking it and putting it down in a certain place, you remove something and then it falls into place, so to speak. And we're allowed to do this, what's called shomet es hashipud maher, and that's called tiltul min atzad. It's almost as if he's leaving his hands, picking his hands up, and the shipud is going to roll into the corner of his room. But tiltul gamur, straight away carrying it and picking it up and lifting it and putting it elsewhere, that's awesome. Omer Rav Chia bar Ashi, Omer Rav Huna, vehu, that which Rav Malki allowed, he permitted tiltul min atzad, kisheyesh alav kizayis, that only applies when there's still one kizayis worth of basar attached to the shibud. It's not totally filth. It's got something that's of substance, of food. And that means that if there's no kizayis basar, then Rav Chia would prohibit even tiltul min atzad. Ravina Omar, afal pishein alav basar mutal taltula. Here's a third shita, and the most extreme lakula. If Rabbi Chia is the most extreme lachumra, that if there's no kizayis basar, then you can't move it even through tiltul de'achet. Then we had Rav Hada's the middle sheet to that he'd allow it till Acher. Comes Ravini says, you know what? I don't need a kazayas, and I don't need tiltal al yidei davar acher. But mutal etaltal, you can just pick it up and put it down wherever he likes to. Where is he going to put it down? A spit is very dangerous. It's got a sharp end to it. And in order to avoid any injury on the part of any of the household members, he puts it in a corner. Now, do we have a precedent to allow us to move muktzah because of the possible danger and somebody might get injured and move it in a way that we protect the people and everyone's secure? And the answer is, says Ravina, miti avia kotes. If we have something that's very, very thorny, it's got thorns, kotzim, it's very sharp, and it's laying in Rishus HaRabim, Chacham are going to allow you to carry it through Rishus HaRabim and put it in a place which is safe. How can they allow you to lift up something in Rishus HaRabim, like a coats, and carry it 4 amos in Rishus HaRabim? You get skila for such a thing. But the answer is, we'll allow, normally it's not allowed, but in this case, because lo yizaku bo rabim, we're going to allow him to carry it 2 amos, put it down, that's called anocha, start an akira again, and every 2 amos, he's going to put it down. We're going to be makil on that Isud Rabbanon of pachos mi'arba amos. Ravina says that the same thing should apply to a shapud, where it's dangerous, and therefore we're allowing to move it tiltul muktzah to prevent any sort of possible injury. Now, once the Gemara brings Rav Malchia, there's another Amor by the name of Malchia, and the Gemara wants to give us the list of halachas that were transmitted by each one of these 2, chachamim, respectively, and not to confuse one and the other, even though their names are very similar. Amar Rav Chinina Breid Ravika. If you want to know which halachas were transmitted by Rav Malchio, these are the following 3. Number 1, shapud, that we said that according to Rav Malchio, shomto, he's allowed to drop it and put it down, let it fall down in a keren zavis, which we call tiltul minatzad. Number 2, shvachos. Okay, that's a Mishnah in Masechet Ksubis, which we'll explain in just a minute. And finally, gumos. What's shvachos and what's gumos? The Mishnah says in Masechet Ksubis on Daf Nun Tes that there's a whole list of malachos which a woman in the framework of Ksubin marriage is committed to implement those malachos b'shubedes l'baylo. But if she brings into the marriage shvachos, maidservants, then depending upon how many she has, the more she has, the greater the diminishing, we could diminish her responsibility as a quid pro quo relationship to the number of shvachos. So, for example, if she brings in 4 shvachos to the marriage, she doesn't have to do any malach. That's the sheet of the Tanakh. Rabbi Eliezer says that even if she brings in 100 shvachos, her husband could insist that she work with wool off the back of the sheep and spin the wool and weave and so forth and so on. Why? Because Rabbi Eliezer holds that batola mevili de zima, that if she's bored because she has nothing, she's a woman of leisure, that's not a good thing. And Rav Malchio there in Masechet Ksubis tells us that we paskin halach like Rabbi Eliezer, and therefore she is obligated to do some minimum amount of malach, which we call meleches tzemer. Gumos is a question about how to identify shtei saros that make the transition from katnus to God. So in a case of a katana and her father unfortunately died, she's an orphan from her father, her mother or one of her brothers, or maybe all of her brothers together, are allowed to marry her off. That's called Kiddushin Min, up until the moment that she has shtei saros. So now we have a machlokas about these shtei saros, which terminate her status as a katana and her ability to be mima'enes. According to Rav Chalbo, in the name of Huna, the shtei saros have to be bisharshon gumos, that the sar has to have a little guma, a little bit of an indentation in the skin. And that's the opinion of Rabbi Chalbo. Now we have Rav Malkia, and he quotes Rav Ada Barava, who disagrees. And if there are gumos, then you don't need saros. And she's a gedola because of these gumos. And therefore, forget about the saros. If she has gumos, which again, Rav Chelba required, then according to Rav Malkio, in the name of Ada, nothing more than gumos are necessary. So don't tell me that you need saros that are coming from gumos. Gumos per se will preclude and terminate her ability to be mama'enes. In any event, these are the three shmuos, the three statements in the name of Rav Malki. Now we go on to three other halachas, which are attributed to Rav Malchia. Number one, bloris. Yeah, this is a sugya in Masechet Avodah Zarah about lifnei iver. When a Jew is giving a haircut to a guy, he should stay very far away from a bloris. Bloris is like the ponytail in the middle of the head, because that's already avodah zarah. So he should avoid any contact. This when he cuts the hair of this guy, he has to stay far away from the bluris. And Rav Malchia tells us that he has to be 3 etzbos away from the bluris l'chol ruah, on every side. Efer mikla, this is Gemara Masechta Makis, and you have ashes from a burn. In other words, if you burnt logs, and the question is, are you allowed to put these ashes on top of a wound? And normally, if the wound is, somewhat serious, we would allow that. But here we have a problem that really has nothing to do with Shabbos. And this problem should be addressed even during the week. If he takes the Ephraim Makla or Mikla and he puts it on his Makkah, an open wound, it looks like he's tattooing, because Ephraim Makla is presumably black, so it's like black ink that's going inside underneath his skin. So that has to be avoided. Ugvina. The Gemara at the end of Masechta Avodah Zarah tells us the Chacham prohibited gvinas nocher. Actually, it's not the end of the Masechta, Chav Tesam Beis. And Rav Malchi explains the reason for this is because Goyim, when they make cheese, they smoothen out the face of the cheese and they use a certain shuman that comes from dover acher, that comes from a swan. And that's Rav Malchi. Rav Papa Amar, he has a different version of Rav Malkia, which statements are attributed to Rav Malkia, and which halachas are attributed to Rav Malkio, Rav Malkio. Masnisa and Masnisa, if it's a matter of Mishnah or Beitza, then Rav Malkia is the one who is, shall we say, interpreting and shedding a light on the Mishnah or the Beitza. However, Shmaitata, if the Amoraim have a discussion halacha and it's not included in the Mishnah, then it's Rav Malkia. Simonech, and if you want a mnemonic device to remember this, it's Masnisin Malkisa. The Mishnayos and the Breises are considered like a melech, like a king. They are primary. It's the Amoraim who came later that tried to understand the words of the king, of the various kings. And that's a simon that any shmua that is an interpretation of the Mishnah or the Beitza, you know that it's Rav Malki. So that's what Rav Papa added to the sugya that we had before of Rav Chinina. And the Gemara wants to know, my Beinayu, is there any difference between Rav Chinina and Rav Papa? And the Gemara says, yes, there is. Ika Beinayu Shfachos. Shfachos, and how the bringing into the shfachos diminishes the responsibility of the wife in terms of her shibudim for malacha, that's in a Mishnah. And yet, according to the opinion of Rav Chinina, this statement of shvachos as a comment on the Mishnah should be attributed to Malkio, Rav Malkio, whereas Rav Papa would say it's not Rav Malkio, but rather it's Rav Malchia, because any comment on a Mishnah is Rav Malchia. We're up to the Mishnah now, on the bottom of Chav Chesam at Beis. Lo yomar adam l'tabach, a person should not say the following words to the butcher who's selling him meat on Yontif, shkoli b'dinar basar, meaning, give me 1 dinar's worth of basar, meaning, weigh the basar and weigh it so that it corresponds to the price of a dinar. And that already is a violation, a zilzul of Yontif, because he's mentioning a dinar, and that's what he's going to pay, obviously after Yontif, for that segment of meat, that weight of meat. Aval shochet, the tabach, is allowed to slaughter meat and not demand any specific price. Umechalik beineim, every lokeach, almost like an honor system, will take that section that he wants, a half of a piece, whatever slice he wants, and that's how they're going to divide up the flesh of the animal, the meat of the animal. And then what they're going to do is they're going to take another animal, which is similar to the animal that was shechted. They'll place it near it, and they're going to say zu kazu, meaning this is the equivalent section of the live animal, and then tomorrow they'll shecht it and they'll pay for that. So the Gemara says that the Mishnah allows you to shecht an animal and divvy up the various segments of the animal, and each buyer is going to get his particular chelik, his section. So the Gemara now wants to clarify, let's say a person doesn't want to buy a full animal, a total animal, right? He doesn't want to buy half an animal, not a third, not even a quarter. He wants to buy according to a certain price. That's all he knows. He doesn't know sizes, weights, or any of that. He knows he wants to pay a dinar. He can pay a chatzi dinar. Maybe if he's rich, he'll pay 2 dinar. So, Hechi Ovid, what can we recommend that he could say to the tabach, this is the amount of basa that I need, when you're not allowed to as the Mishnah says, Shkoli b'dinar basa, you're not allowed to be mazkir damim on Yontif. And the Gemara clarifies, ki ha, like there was a minhag in certain places where it was customary to slice up the flesh of the animal, the meat of the animal, into equal pieces, and a person would order X number of pieces, and that's what he would purchase. And there was a set price for X number of pieces, because again, all the pieces of the basar are the same size. And they changed the name of the pieces of that, the sections of meat. And as you'll see here on the top of Chavtes Amud Aleph, Surah Amri Tarta, in the area called Surah, they would say to the Tabach, give me a Tarta. Or, for example, Upalgu Tarta, give me half a Tarta. In another area called Norash, in that location, Amri, they would say to the Tabach, namely, Chelka Upalgu Chelka, give me one piece and another half. Padisa, in the third location, Amri, they would say to the butcher, Uzia Upalgi Uzia, Benar Pkod, Bechem B'Mas Machas Amri, Riva Upalgu Riva. And you're allowed to buy meat from the butcher with these names on Yontif. And that leads us to the Mishnah here on Daf Chavtes Amud Aleph, which Emir Hashem will cover in the next year.